Is the separation of church and state biblical? That is the question that I hope to answer in this video. Hi, my name is Alan. Welcome to my channel. For those of you who are new, my channel is dedicated to me talking about my faith and how my faith helps to inform a lot of the public policies that I like to advocate for in hopes of making this a better world. So just a few weeks ago, back in May, President Trump held a rally on the National Mall, and it was called Recommit 250. And basically, it was a call to recommit the United States of America to God. There were a lot of prominent politicians who were associated with the Trump administration who spoke there, and basically they all generally spoke about how Americans needed to return to God. And as a proud Christian, that sounds very appealing to my ear. Who doesn't want Americans to give their lives to God? But what I found concerning was that I heard a few of the speakers talk about how they addressed the separation of church and state and how that was no longer needed. In fact, they said that it's unconstitutional, and basically calling for America to become a de facto Christian nation. So in this video, I just wanted to address that. What is the separation of church and state, and why does it exist? To begin with, we have to go back to the Constitution. When it was written and implemented, soon after they added the Bill of Rights. And the very first amendment, part of it states that the government cannot establish any religion. And essentially that just means that government cannot favor one religion over the other. And the reason why this was important and was in the very first amendment was because our founders understood that the pioneers of this country who first arrived from Europe were escaping religious oppression that was imposed by the government who favored one religion over the others. And so from the very founding of our country, there was an understanding that there was a separation of church and state. But then somewhere around the late 1900s, there were several politicians, prominent politicians, who began to speak up and advocate for America becoming a Christian nation. And they founded an organization called the National Reform Association, which advocated for America to become a Christian nation, specifically advocating for Sunday to become a day of rest for all residents of the United States, regardless of whether you were a Sunday keeper or not. Now, there existed a Christian denomination at the time known as the Seventh-day Baptists. Actually, they continue to exist today. But they observed the Sabbath not on Sunday, but on Saturday. And their response to this legislation that was pushed by the NRA was to say that they're not going to resist it, but they were just requesting if they could carve out an exception for them so that the Seventh-day Baptists could continue to observe their Sabbath on Saturday and not Sunday. Now, at that time, there also existed a new denomination, Christian denomination, known as the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And they also observed their Sabbath on Saturday, not Sunday. But their approach was very different from the Seventh-day Baptists. Their approach was to say that they opposed the entire notion of Sunday becoming a day of rest and being enforced as a day of rest for all residents of the United States. And they did so on the basis of the separation of church and state. And so, full disclosure, I personally am Seventh-day Adventist, a proud Seventh-day Adventist. And so I know a little bit about our history. And what we said at that time was that enforcing a religion on American residents is unconstitutional, and that the government should not be getting involved in enforcing religion. And because who gets to decide who is a Christian, and by what criteria do you determine that? It kind of reminds me of what's going on right now with the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, and him removing the Mormons from the category of Christian denominations. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church went on to say that the Constitution makes no mention of God. It is a godless document, which sounds heretical, but it's true. But then the NRA responded by accusing the Seventh-day Adventist Church of promoting an atheistic form of government in the United States, to which the Seventh-day Adventist Church replied by saying, and I quote, "As far as man or civil government is concerned, the atheist has just as much a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as the Christian." And then the Seventh-day Adventist leadership went on to say that they opposed any form of religious test on Americans, even if it were to favor their particular observance of the seventh-day Sabbath. But what does the Bible say that can help inform us on this concept of the separation of church and state? Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world," which is to say that he doesn't identify with any of these earthly governments. Jesus also says, "Give unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and unto God what belongs to God," which is essentially to say that his kingdom is drastically different than any earthly kingdom, any earthly government. And we can see this by just reading the book of Matthew, chapter 5, the Beatitudes, where Jesus says things like, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Which stands in stark contrast to what's currently going on with the Trump administration and our war with Iran, which you could say is a just war. But it's very starkly different from anything that Christ would advocate for, because God is a God of love. Jesus is love. And Jesus doesn't coerce or force people through violence to come to him. Jesus loves them, and they freely choose to come to Jesus. And again, when it comes to earthly governments, there is a role for force and coercion, because of course we want to make sure that citizens are abiding by the laws. But as far as God's kingdom, force and violence will never suffice. It's the devil who uses force and violence to try to get his way. But that's not the way of Jesus. And so, when we hear individuals and politicians speak up about how they want America to become a Christian nation, and they're wanting to get rid of the separation of church and state, it's important for us, even if it seems very unlikely to happen, it's really important for us to speak up and tell them to pause and think about it, and remind them about the history of our country and how we were founded and why we were founded in the way that we were, to remind them why it's important to have a separation between church and state. Seventh-day Adventists are kind of unique in that we have this belief that the United States, as great a country as it is, will one day play a key role in ushering in the Antichrist at the end of times. And so I guess you would say we're more alert to resisting, that becoming a reality. And that kind of beckons the question, why do we resist the inevitable? And I heard a preacher speak about it this past Sabbath, and he said that the reason why we resist is because there's always one more soul to win for Jesus. And so I guess that's the perspective we have. But yeah, that's just my video. I hope that this was informative. If you have a different opinion, I'd love to hear from you. But thank you, and God bless.